The focus of this year's gathering is to collaboratively move the peace and humanitarian agenda. Our next plenary, entitled Mobilizing Humanitarian Action, will discuss the multitude of ways companies can undertake to address humanitarian needs of conflict-affected populations. I am more than pleased to call upon the moderator of this session, who is one of the 2018 UN Global Compact SDG pioneers and the CEO of Committed to Good. Our moderator is leading a company that has grown from humble beginnings in Afghanistan in 2006 to a company that today operates in 21 conflict-affected countries to enable humanitarian projects. Please help me welcome Ms. Alice Loguer. And now I would like to invite our distinguished speakers to come up the stage. I will call Mr. Laurent Debouc, the Chief of Mission at the International Organization for Migration in Egypt. Mr. Karim Atassi, the representative of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Egypt. And Mr. Jacques Mendoza, the Director of the International and Investor Relations at System Capital Management. All right, Alice.
Hello. Okay, you can hear me now. Can I pass the mic? I suddenly thought I was down to 2 panelists and started panicking. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be looking to kind of continue on from the discussions of earlier, and it was very interesting listening to how it's important to stand up corruption, and I really like the way that you brought in the whole gender perspective into the conversation. And I want to kind of continue the discussion, but I want to hone in more on the countries and the people affected by the humanitarian crisis. Now, in this actual session in itself, we're actually going to be looking at mobilizing humanitarian action. And we're going to be discussing the Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees, how the UN cluster system supports this, and we'll be looking into some concrete examples of how the UN is already working on sustainable solutions with the private sector, and also we will hear from the private sector on how they're addressing humanitarian crisis. Now, the organisers have allowed me to be a little bit controversial because I have now only one member from the private sector on the panel. And so I would like to ask if anyone in the audience would like to join our panel, preferably someone from the private sector, and to add a bit of a gender perspective, maybe even a woman. If you'd like to come and join, it would be appreciated. We have a lady over there, please. For the audience's benefit, we'll have about a half-hour panel discussion, and so if we'll just start, if the lady who's kindly joined our panel would like to start off by introducing yourself and the organisation you're from.
I'm Soha El-Baklawi. I'm founder of Businessita Women Empowerment. It's basically to empower women in business, to help them enrich their career and gain financial dependency for a better living and better community.
Fantastic, thank you. I'll introduce you to the other panelists that we're honoured to have here today. Perhaps you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves one at a time in a minute.
Yes, so good morning everyone. My name is Laurent Debouc. I represent the International Organization for Migration in Egypt. My career has been about focusing on countries in crisis, human-made or natural disasters related, and I arrived in Egypt from Yemen in January this year.
Sabah al-Khair, good morning. I'm Jock Mendoza-Wilson. I'm the Director of International and Investor Relations for System Capital Management Group, which is headquartered in Kiev, Ukraine. We're the country's largest financial and industrial group with about 300,000 employees spread across the country. For the past 4 years, however, since the conflict in the east of Ukraine, I've also been a member of the United Nations Humanitarian Country Team, where I represent our foundation, which is the Rinat Akhmetov Foundation, named after the company's owner. That foundation has a significant humanitarian operation, which I'll talk about in my comments. I'm also the chairperson of the Global Compact in Ukraine.
My name is Karim Atasi. I'm the UNHCR representative to Egypt and to the League of Arab States. I've been in Cairo for the last 2 years. Before, I was for 7 years deputy representative of UNHCR in Turkey at the time of the beginning of the Syria crisis and of the mixed migration flows that went from Turkey to Europe through Greece. And all in all, I have been for 27 years with UNHCR, 27 years in the Middle East, so I have been a little bit on all the fronts where they have been, that we have had in our region during this period. Thank you.
I'm introducing myself. Do you want again?
Only if you want to add anything more. Only if you want to add anything more. So, a lot of the countries who need the 2030 agenda to work are those facing enormous humanitarian crises. Countries such as Iraq, such as South Sudan, such as Ukraine, such as Yemen and Syria. These are countries where it's a man-made crisis, and that have caused an enormous major refugee and migration crisis, which actually impacts many other countries such as Egypt and Libya. My company, Committed to Good, or CTG as we're known in the countries where we help support humanitarian projects, one of the projects we actually get involved in is the monitoring of the detention centres in Libya. Now, there are a large number of registered detention centres which are actually run by the Ministry of Interior, and then there are others that are unregistered which are run by human traffickers. And, I can't even begin to explain some of the horrors that are actually faced in these detention centres. You have hundreds of people living in a room together. I mean, they've been counted up to about 500. Largely, these are women and children. Rape is definitely prevalent, and there's minimal or even no sanitation in some of these detention centres. And it's amazing we are able to go to these detention centres, and we're able to see this, and we're able to identify the problem. But, it's about us all coming together and working together on a sustainable solution. So I want to reflect now on the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact for Migration, which addresses some of these human rights. It looks at the protection of migrants, it looks at women's rights and many other areas. As a precursor, in September 2016, the UN member states adopted the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants to share the burden and responsibility for hosting and supporting the world refugees. This same declaration calls upon the private sector to play an active role in the implementation of these global compacts. Now, I'd like to turn to our UN members to actually educate us and brief us on what these two global compacts are, which are actually very different. And Laura, if I could perhaps ask you to start by defining what is the difference between a migrant and a refugee?
Thank you. Well, I think it's an essential question, and indeed sometimes confusing for a lot of people by common discourse on one or another. I think Karim is better placed than me to explain what a refugee is, but they fall under a certain protocol which is looking at their the protection according to some criteria, so that those people who may be fleeing discrimination and asking for protection to another country, while a migrant is anyone who is basically mobile and crossing or not its borders. So migrants are generally referred, common sense, as economic migrants, so those who are trying to contemplate migration as a solution, a durable solution for the situation that they face. But it's not only that, they may also be actually moving for other reasons, without necessarily knowing that they may fall under protection or certain protocol. This is the reason why, to make it less evident, both UNHCR and IOM work together on what we call mixed migration flows. So it's those people who are in need of protection being under a protection need, or those who are actually moving in looking for better solutions or looking abroad on how they can contribute to other societies. They may have the common need, or if it's not addressed, they may fall under abuse. And you have mentioned rightly trafficking, but we have to add also an increase of smuggling of migrants, so facilitating the crossing of a border by extracting funding from those migrants.
I still am on. Karim, would you mind talking about the Global Compact for refugees?
Thank you for the opportunity for being here, and thanks for the question. There is one test that we can ask ourselves, or we can ask a person in order to very broadly determine whether that person is a refugee or is a migrant. Is, can he or can she return back safely home? It's very simple. This is not a sophisticated definition, but refugees are forcibly displaced and they cannot go back. That's it. While a migrant is somebody who has chosen to leave for maybe compelling reason, improving his livelihood, work opportunity. There are compelling reasons for people to leave that are not really related to their physical safety or persecutions, but this is a good test. And is it okay better? Sorry. And the region, the Middle East, our region, today we count almost 50% of the refugees worldwide are within the Middle East. We have the largest refugee caseload in the world, which is the Syrian, and we are also hosting in this part of the world the oldest refugee caseload, which is the Palestinian. Both of them are approximately 10 million refugees. The Global Compact on Refugees, that the starting point was the New York Declaration that you mentioned in September 2016. The immediate goal was to reply to the crisis that has happened in 2015-2016 with an explosion of the number of persons that are on the move, refugees and migrants. They were both. And those who had arrived in Europe were both in 2015-2016. They were refugees and migrants, although in terms of proportion, there were more refugees than migrants at that time. Now it's a little bit changing because of the profile of the person that had arrived to Europe. It was mainly Syrian, Afghans, and Iraqis.
Thank you. Do you want to just keep the mic for 2 seconds? Because I'd like to ask you how UNHCR is enhancing partnerships with host communities to foster coexistence with refugee groups.
Could you repeat?
Sorry, how is UNHCR enhancing partnerships with host communities to foster coexistence with refugee groups?
Yeah. Well, the number are so big of the refugees in the region during the last 7 years that they have weakened host state. If you remember, in 2011, at the beginning of what is commonly called the Arab Spring, the question was, who will be next in terms of country. It was one country, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. And then the question, when refugees started arriving in mass in neighboring country, was, will the host country collapse or not? The entire region was upside down, and host communities had to be supported. The needs were huge, and the international response, or what was available in terms of international response, was inadequate. The international humanitarian community was taken by surprise by the size and the volume of the crisis. New partnership needed to be built, and the humanitarian actor had to reach out in order to establish a new partnership. So the business community is definitely one of them, and we will talk maybe in detail about what are the potential with the business community, but host community also had to be strengthened. And in particular, social cohesion in states that were already at risk because the entire region was at risk. It was not only the host community that was at risk, it is the concept of nation state that was at risk. This is what made it imperative to work with the, to have more effort toward the host community. In UNHCR, we have developed some concept like community-based protection, where we are reaching out in order to discuss and to understand the challenges not only of the refugee community, but also of the local community that are hosting the refugee community. And together with UNDP, we have developed a concept of response which for the first time had two pillars, which was a humanitarian pillar for refugees themselves and resilience in order to support host community. And to give you a clear example, for instance, municipalities. Municipalities are on the front line, and municipalities need to be supported by the international communities. And we are developing now project and reaching out to municipalities throughout the region. Let me be more specific. For example, in Cairo. We have in Cairo a city not very far from Cairo itself, which is called the city of 6 October, that is hosting large number of refugees. And they are concentrating in areas where UNHCR, Egypt, we took the initiative of developing a plan for that zone that we did with the developer, of course, and then we gave this development plan to the municipality. And the municipality studied it, they assessed it, and they said this is an excellent development plan for the region, which is hosting both refugees and Egyptian nationals. And they decided that they will implement it themselves. So this is just one example how we can reach out to host community in order to strengthen their response capacity and respond to the need of the refugees that they are generously hosting.
Okay, one more question before you pass the mic away. Coming on to this sort of public-private partnerships and working with the private sector, within the Global Compact on Refugees, it actually talks about a program of action and areas of support. Can some of these areas be adopted by the private sector in examples how you've just shared? And how does the private sector initiate these discussions with UNHCR?
The Global Compact on Refugee is a response to the size of the humanitarian crisis that have become bigger. And it has several pillars. One of them is how we can collectively support countries at the stage of the reception and admission of refugees. The identification of refugees at an early stage and their documentation is a crucial step in order to allow them to benefit from the social services or the assistance that UNHCR and the international community will give them at a later stage. So there is the stage of reception, of admission, there is the stage of identifying the needs of the refugees, and here the concept is through assessing and determining and identifying vulnerability. The key word here is vulnerability, and providing assistance to the host community. We just gave an example, and finding solutions for the refugee crisis, which include the traditional solutions that the international community had developed during the past decades, and which are resettlement whenever possible, voluntary repatriation home when the situation will allow refugees to go back in safety and dignity, and local integration whenever the circumstances will allow it. But we need to go beyond those traditional solution and find what can work in terms of long-term solutions for refugees who are living and staying in a protracted situation, and the identification of other legal pathway for refugees to be able to move from their country of asylum to another country where they would like to go. Lawfully, of course, legal pathway.
Thank you for that. I'd like to now turn to the private sector members of the panel and just talk a little bit about what this looks like in reality. Now, Jock, perhaps you can talk a little bit about why your business, Systems Capital Management, actually decided to become involved in providing humanitarian aid, and what is it specifically you're doing? Because you do get involved with migration and things like that.
Yeah. You know, as a business, I think conflict struck Ukraine in a way as a surprise. Although there was some political instability and a change in government, we hadn't expected this attempt at annexation of the two provinces in the east of the country by Russian-backed and funded separatists. It so happened that the business, System Capital Management, was headquartered in Donetsk, which is the large city in the east of Ukraine of over 1 million citizens. That was the locus of the conflict. And so our business, and I myself, were headquartered in that city when this conflict began. And so our response was organic. We were living through the conflict. The people working in our business were impacted by the conflict. I myself and my colleagues had to leave the city to flee under an assumed identity to be able to escape arrest by the de facto Russian-backed authorities. So it was an instinctive, organic response to a catastrophic situation. But we were able to respond quickly and effectively because, you know, for example, we had introduced a system-wide corporate responsibility program in our business. Now, many of our businesses were located in the areas under conflict. So we were used to being part of a community and helping the community. And so when disaster struck, when conflict broke out, the community looked to us to assist. On the other side, we had a foundation, a philanthropic foundation. So we had people who understood how to set up and run programs. And so we brought together all of the resources of our group, the foundation, the business. We also have a very famous football club for any football fans in the audience called Shakhtar Donetsk, which had very strong and deep roots in the community. And we pulled those three pillars together to create a coherent response. And one other factor that was crucial is that our business is, we have 300,000 employees across Ukraine. We have a great deal of resource, people, and crucially also money. My boss, the owner of the company, Rinat Akhmetov, it's his home city, so we didn't have to go and find money. He just said, this is our problem. We need to respond. These are our people. How do we help? What is our system response? So we had the money, we had the resources, we had the expertise. What we didn't know is how to run humanitarian operations. But we quickly found that out and drew in the very best practices from some of our international partners, certainly from UN agencies like UNHCR, for example, who I deal with regularly in Ukraine, like IOM, who we work with, and also, very importantly, INGOs, ICRC, and MSF, for example. We drew from their inspiration, particularly on principles. One of the toughest things when you're in a conflict zone is that people want you to choose sides. That's even harder when you're a domestic actor. And the most dangerous thing you can do in that situation is to choose sides, because you have to be independent and equitable and transparent. And what you have to do is to ensure all parties to the conflict that your interests are only in acting in the interest of civilians who are in need.
Okay, now Joe, you have some pretty impressive statistics, and I'm not sure if there is actually a slide with some of your
I have
statistics.
them here anyway. Yeah, I mean
if we can share it, it would be
I'll
great.
share them. Yeah, we geared up very quickly, bringing together all of our resources, and so we were shipping 42 articulated trucks of food aid across the contact line, which is the conflict line that separates the Russian-backed separatists from the Ukrainian forces. Twice a week, 42 trucks. It's a huge amount of aid, and we concentrated our actions. Firstly, we worked on evacuating families and citizens in need in the peak moments of conflict to take them out of harm's way. And in most cases, in our view, we moved them to Ukrainian-held territory. The second and largest part of our program was food aid. So we gave food aid for those, because markets were closed, shops were closed, people didn't have incomes or money, the normal structure of society had broken down in the conflict zone. So there was an urgent need for food aid. To date, we've provided over 12 million food packs to over 1.2 million citizens. So enormous figures. We evacuated 39,000 citizens. We also have another program called Targeted Aid, where people in need, for example, if their buildings may have been shelled, they may have lost a family member, they may have been injured in an attack, we will provide urgent emergency need to them and rehabilitation. And 50,000 citizens have benefited from that. Also, the cost of war, the psychological cost of war, is enormous. And so we instituted a program of training psychologists to reach out, particularly to families and children, to help children and their families recover from the trauma of war and adapt back into society. So those were the sort of 4 pillars of our program that we instituted. And we still run those programs now. I mean, the conflict is regrettably absolutely alive. I looked at the figures immediately before coming here to give you the update, because I have to say, people sometimes forget there's a real conflict happening right now in Europe, and the figures are pretty catastrophic. 216 civilians have been killed this year to date. 920 have been injured. The current casualties are heavier for civilians than for military. And in total, over 10,000 people have been killed and 24,000 injured. So, we still have a massive amount of work to do, as do my colleagues in the UN agencies and in INGOs and NGOs. And none of this relief operation and humanitarian operation would be possible, including ours, without leveraging the power of NGOs and communities. We provide resources and money and expertise and people, but to reach out into the small village that's lost its water supply and its power supply and medical aid, you need citizens, committed citizens.
I have to say that in the work I do, I like to think of myself as a humanitarian. And even though I work in the private sector, like you get to see the horrors that are actually faced by human beings, and it really upsets me so much that this happens. Now I'd like to turn to our newest panelist, and perhaps to bring a gender perspective on this, because a lot of people who are actually impacted by this are women and children. And I'd like to, first of all, if you could tell us a little bit about what it is your organisation does in respect to providing humanitarian aid and mobilising humanitarian action.
Okay, first of all, I'm probably one of the luckiest people to be here and to have my startup only less than a year, winning a couple of awards of appreciation. Let's say that business is a part of the whole humanitarian action. Honestly, it's the first time for me to attend something related to peace. However, we, as a woman growing up in diverse cultures, I've always noticed that there is gender inequality on different levels, whether you're in the Middle East or in a foreign country in Europe or something like that. So I took the initiative about mid-2017 to make a difference to the women, to help empower them, help them strengthen their image, help them live with dignity. And relating here to Mr. Karim's words about the refugees and the women, the company is located in 6 October City. And 2 months after I launched, refugee women came and asked for support to start launching their business professionally, because of course they were displaced in an inhuman matter. Some of them did not complete their education, others had to work in other sectors regardless of their education and stuff like that, and all of them lacked the financial support. And they just wanted to provide safety for their families and stable income. So Businessita just tried to help or connect these two channels together. We work on the women themselves, their mindset. We try to overcome the damage that happened, regardless if they're refugees or just regular women under societal stereotypes. We empower them by giving them the knowledge, the power, by showing them how to, guiding them through the process of starting their own business with their idea, validation, stuff like that. Of course, this change in their mindset automatically reflects on their children. I have, till now, in about 6 months, I have 7 success stories of women who actually launched their business. 3 of them are refugees, Syrian, and the other 4 are regular Egyptians. And some of them, regardless the marital status, but all of them have noticed their upgrade or their development in even with their kids and making the difference on their level.
Can you tell us a success story?
I tell you a success story of one of them. One of my clients is called Randa. She is a Syrian. She was displaced. She was an AUC graduate from Syria. She was displaced to Cairo about 4 years ago. She got married away from her parents because not all her parents could attend to Egypt. She had a child about 1 year after that. Her husband was Syrian too, but he was working, I don't know the job title exactly, but something like a delivery boy or something like that. And she needed to help him with the income, so she actually started cooking for others. And this hurted her dignity and made her feel like she's a second person. She started with me about 4 months ago, and now she launched her own handcrafted business. She was always passionate about making decorations and working stuff handmade and stuff like that. And she actually now, in the last quarter, she made a profit of 20 grants. So this, for me and for her, is rewarding, of course.
Thank you. I'm actually going to bring the microphone back to Laurent here, who can talk to us a little bit about his thoughts on migrants and their role in society. The private sector has already been mobilized around the SDGs, and as I understand it, the Global Compact for Migration is consistent with Target 10.7 and of the 2030 Agenda. And it has fairly weighty 23 objectives that need to be met. Within this mind, looking for solutions, what opportunities do you see where the private sector and civil society can play a much larger role in contributing to the solution and in helping migrants?
Oh, yes, indeed. So the Global Compact, will be endorsed in a month with 23 objectives. The 23rd is partnership. So already the private sector, as it's placed, it's basically ensuring that migration governance is done through a whole of society approach. So any actors is necessary to look at the aspects of migration. The 22 others, basically, I think the main point is that it's a unique document where you have all aspects of migration management gathered. It's divided through a very long series of objectives, and then under each objective some type of activities. But at least it's one document which is encompassing all of those aspects that governments in the world would hopefully endorse. It's ambitious, but actually it's reflecting what, as an organization, we are advising our member states since 1951. So it's for us, we are quite keen to see it ongoing. It's not a binding document, it's just a guide for governments, for other actors, civil society, private sector to look at on how we should address migration and migration governance. There are very specific objectives which relate, I would say, directly into the private sector. When we talk about recruitment of migrants and the guarantee that they have minimum standards, wage, days off, so the conditions of work to avoid exploitation. So that, I think, is directly linked to the role the private sector can play. The social portability, for example, it was one objective, is also something that private sector can look at. So there are some chapters specifically related to private sector involvement into migration management. Others are more vague and generalistic. But counter trafficking, it's certainly a subject where we need all of the society involved. It relates to exploitation, it relates to trafficking networks, and everyone has a role to play. But the document is a non-binding document. It's more a guide. At least it summarizes all aspects that any actor can look at or should look at to guarantee that migration is well governed and migrants are considered positively and certainly guaranteed some basic rights.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's important for us to consider migrants as regular citizens. We actually have a project in Libya where we do hire migrants to help rehabilitate the local communities that we work in. And you mentioned today about the success stories in Egypt alone, and how actually it can create economic prosperity and it can be good for business. And we shouldn't be shy of that. Perhaps I want to ask just two more questions, and then I'd like to turn to the audience. Lauren, you've actually worked in a number of different conflict-affected countries in Yemen and Congo. Can you give us an example where you've seen the private sector be well engaged?
Well, yes, I can take the example of the Democratic Republic of Congo. As you may know, the country is extremely rich in natural resources, and particularly the mining industry. It's across the board in any of the crises I have worked. Any war requests a lot of funding and a lot of money. There is a collapse generally, well, I think all the time, of the rule of law. Different groups are fighting each other and trying to find funds to actually continue doing so. The economy is transforming into an economy of war, where you have everything possible and every abuse possible. I think the basic of the involvement and certainly the best contribution the private sector can do in building or rebuilding peace and reconstruction, to me, is based on ethics. And that's what we have worked with in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we work with corporate of a private sector to guarantee that they will not purchase the natural resources of Congo during the war unless there were certain conditions of ethics. Because by purchasing those the gold, any of those resources would just fuel the conflict, continue fueling the conflict. So we had big, quite large worldwide companies committing to purchase any of the natural resources of Congo in IT, telecommunication companies or others, and then guaranteeing that the money of those will not go to the rebels or to the fighting groups. And that, I think, was a quite beautiful example on how international companies, not necessarily coming like our colleague does here, coming on the ground, but from far in the United States, in Canada, there were some companies of Ukraine as well, engaging not to fueling a conflict. And that's based to us on ethics. And it's stopping possibilities for conflicts to actually find funding. That's what was one. In the Yemeni context, unfortunately, the corruption get extremely high. Also because the groups needed to purchase a lot of weapons, and so the economy of war was starting. But I didn't see, because the Yemeni context is much more complex, we didn't see really a commitment of the private sector. Everything collapsed, everybody left the country, companies closed, and so only some Yemeni businessmen helped us to bring into the country the humanitarian aid and the basic support we could provide to the people in need. But there was no real commitment of the private sector, and we hope to see it. Certainly the reconstruction, hopefully in the time of peace, would certainly require private sector investment in a drastic way.
Doc, just before we move to the floor, I'd like to just ask you, it's really interesting to me how you're engaging with the UN at the country team level, and you're involved with the UN cluster system, which I certainly haven't heard of, and I think some of our UN counterparts haven't heard of a huge amount of private sector engagement. Can you talk about how you work and cooperate with the UN and the other humanitarian organisations that you also work with amongst the cluster system, and what's been the benefit of these partnerships? How has it benefited the people that need aid?
I think, firstly, how we come to cooperate so closely is simply a matter of circumstance. That we were there, we scaled up quickly, we immediately became a significant humanitarian actor in the area of conflict, and so we were on the ground cooperating with the UN agencies. When the UN put in place its crisis system, there's the appointment of a humanitarian coordinator, typically the setup of a humanitarian country team, and the humanitarian country team, which I'm a member of representing our foundation and our humanitarian work, is drawn together from NGOs, so national NGOs. We are one of those. INGOs, including people like MSF and ICRC, and UN agencies, and it's chaired by the UN resident coordinator. So the connectivity is through the involvement in the humanitarian country team as a national NGO. So that was the first element, and essential, because we were the biggest provider of aid into the area that was controlled by the separatists. And so, we were a crucial part of that delivery. We're providing more aid than ICRC or any individual UN agency. So to be able to operate effectively, we had to coordinate together. So we were effectively then, we joined the cluster system. The cluster system in either, in this case, a man-made disaster of conflict or a natural disaster. The cluster system pulls together in areas of specialization, UN agencies, INGOs in some cases, and local NGOs. And we are a part of the food security and livelihoods cluster because that's where we make our biggest contribution with our significant food aid program. So there, I sit on the strategic advisory board, and we vet and approve the projects that are then funded by donors. We ourselves don't need any money, we provide our own money, but coordination is crucial on the ground in delivering to situations in need. For example, we were putting 42 big trucks through the contact line, a difficult place to operate, twice a week. We didn't want to all arrive at the same time. So if our trucks were arriving, we didn't want ICRC to be there or MSF to be there at the same time, or the World Food Programme. So we ensured we coordinated our deliveries. So that was just deliveries into the conflict zone, and then inside the conflict zone, on an operational level, we share in detail recipients, communities we're delivering to, the time we're delivering to them, so that the aid reaches the people that need it when they need it. And you can only really do that in a coordinated response if you integrate your systems into the UN system that's been set up to provide delivery. So that's what we did, and that's been one of my tasks for the last 4 years, is to do that. It is tricky because the UN isn't the easiest organization to work with, and if you come from a business background, it sometimes looks over complex. But I can say now, after 4 years of doing it, it does work, and it's the best system is to coordinate through the UN organizations to deliver aid on the ground to those who need it.
I mean, it's you told me a bit more about it earlier, which is fascinating. But I think the biggest scare for the public sector is, of course, that fear of the private sector looking for commercial gain in something like this, and that's where actually it's not really strictly true. And when you say you're a significant donor of the food aid, I think you said something around 50% is coming from the private sector donation.
Yeah, I think that there is distrust initially in the UN system sometimes of the private sector and private sector motives. And I understand from detailed conversations with my UN colleagues also why, is because not all private sector actors are good actors. So it requires the private sector itself to work on the basis of good governance and sound principles to be trusted by the UN. But if you can attach and work with good private sector actors, they really leverage the power of the UN system. And I believe that's what we've done. I mean, I use the same lobby points as the UN. I discuss with the resident coordinator and OCHA, who coordinate aid, what we should talk about. I take that messages out. We are really partners, but it's a partnership of desire to deliver for citizens in need. It's not a financial partnership. Our money is separate from theirs, but our goals are the same. The desire to reach people and be effective is the same. And I think that when I speak to my UN colleagues, they say sometimes they like me in meetings and ask me to turn up. So I take a different private sector results-orientated approach to the outcome of the meeting, which sometimes helps cut through lots of what I might describe, and my UN colleagues may criticize me for it, is sometimes the internal politics and missions that different agencies have and how they sometimes don't always cooperate to the maximum you would expect, even in times of crisis. And I think I don't have an issue with one mission or another mission. I have an issue to help deliver aid to people, and that sometimes is very effective in doing that with my UN colleagues. But it's not about private sector being better. It's simply about all of us working together are a much more effective mechanism than either the UN and NGOs or business. It is when we work together as a team and build trust and work closely together that we can actually deliver results on the ground. And I think that ultimately is what matters to all of us in the work that we do, particularly when many of us are spending our working life and our private life on these projects, because it's all consuming, as you know. And I think everybody here knows, when you become involved, it doesn't stop at 5 p.m. or it doesn't stop at the weekend. It carries on.
I think it's a great example of SDG 17 anyway. Now I'd like to turn to the audience. Oh, we have one hand, very quick. Can we have a microphone? Can I donate a microphone? Oh, that one doesn't work. Here, I'll donate my microphone for the... Oh, you've got one behind you.
Good. My name is Cornelis Hulsman. I have been here for 42 years in Egypt, or coming and going, but for a long time. And I have a question for Mr. De Boek. It's a question about female migrant workers here in Egypt, so to bring the discussion to Egypt and to women. My background, I'm the director of the Center for Intercultural Dialogue and Translation and the former director of the Dutch Immigration Foundation. So I've been in migration for a long time. You have here in Egypt a problem with primarily African women who are coming here to Egypt to find a job. They are coming here on tourist visa, trying to find jobs with different Egyptian employers. Some get a work permit, others don't. The Belgian ambassador is an example of this. She has a domestic worker and is capable of providing a work permit, but many others are not. Diplomats usually can, but others do not. So you have a whole group of this. Then they get arrested by Egyptian police, are locked up in police cells in horrible circumstances. I've been to such a police center, seeing those women there. They are only able to leave Egypt once they pay a fine for overstaying their visa and their ticket to go back. And they try later to come back to Egypt because the circumstances in Egypt for work are still better than those in their home countries where they're coming from. So it's a problem for this particular category and specifically for IOM. How are you dealing with this?
Yeah, thank you. It's indeed an unfortunate reality for people. There are also networks facilitating the entry, either as tourists, but with the aim of ending up into the domestic work. We have programs of support for helping people to return back home, where we deal with authorities and we can negotiate the cancellation of the fees to be paid, or we support them ourselves through our programs, allowing the people to receive the exit visa. So you have to understand that to leave the country, you must be in regular situation. Otherwise, you pay a fee per day of overstay. But so as an organization, we discuss with the government on possibility to alleviate this, and we organize the return. In some instances, the people have lost their papers, their ID documents or passports, or they have been actually they are not valid anymore. So we discuss through our either the diplomatic representations in Egypt or our offices in the country of origin to the renewal of the documents. In some instances, it's complicated because they may not be necessarily recognized, or they may be suspicion for falsified documents. But so we work also with the authorities on this. While we provide those services, we also look at the potential exploitation of the people. Some have not been paid, or they may end up and come to us because their employer is rejecting them without paying them. As a domestic worker, they are supposed to stay in the house of their employer, so they end up in the street. So we provide support with housing until the time they can find, or also medical services until the time we find a longer solution. If they have been entering the country through smugglers or traffickers, we gather information on those networks, and while guaranteeing the protection of the person, because in some instances we have to hide them if they pass information on the smugglers and traffickers, who may know then about the fact that they share information. They try to harm them or kill them. So we put them in hidden, secret shelters until we find a durable solution, mainly return. So there are a lot of possibility for providing support. This being said, we do not have a long list of people coming to us with such requests. Generally, if they end up in the street, they try to go back to the community who takes care of them until they try to find an alternative in the country. They know that by going back and getting the exit formalities, they will not be able to come back here, and unless they use again a trafficking network or a smuggling network, so which is costly. So they prefer staying in a regular situation here, which unfortunately ends up in abuses, other type of exploitation, or raping in the case of women, as you mentioned.
If a company's, just on a practical perspective, if a company is going to look to recruit, help with this, the solution and recruit migrants, how should they go about taking steps to legalize that?
Well, there is a law in Egypt which is privileging the recruitment of Egyptians first. We have to consider the fact that Egypt has an important demographic growth with approximately 1.2 million people entering the labor market every year. So the privilege is to employ Egyptians. There is a possibility for enterprises to take up to 10% of non-Egyptian, but they have to justify the reasons. So there are some objective reasons like language. There are some companies here which have opened recently, and it's a telecommunication or people in the world can call centers here, which are called from the world. So they need and they look for people speaking a series of languages that Egyptians do not necessarily talk. So that's a valid reason for recruiting foreigners in Egypt. But otherwise, the law is privileging and is protective to the Egyptian labor force, as it is. It's not as it is in majority of the countries in the world.
Okay, thank you. Did that answer your question?
Yes, but one thing, there is what you probably don't know, but there is a Kenyan network here in Cairo. And these are women all together that are supporting each other when there is someone in need. So it's very interesting to see that in this community there's a support network as well, but I don't think they are aware of what you're doing as IOM.
If I need to say it in English for the translators? So this gentleman is referring to networks of support of existing migrants in the country when someone falls outside any employment, and this is true indeed, and it's not only Kenyans, but it's also the Ethiopians, Sudanese, South Sudanese, Syrians, and which is a beauty in a sense that there is a solidarity among them to protect each other, but we do not interact with them, or they know we exist, and we don't force anyone to use our services.
Thank you very much, Alice. I think one area where all the humanitarian actors during the last few years have not concentrated enough is the capability of the refugees. Capability of the refugees. Refugees can sustain themselves, as you have rightly mentioned, but there are obstacles, there are constraints in the entire region. I'm not talking here about Egypt in particular, but in the entire region, there are obstacles. There are good initiatives. I have been approached by a major corporation in Egypt who told me a few weeks ago they want to employ refugees. But there is only one nationality that they can employ because that nationality doesn't need a work permit. For all the others, they need work permit, and this is an obstacle for corporation. One interesting experience has happened in Jordan. I just would like very quickly to describe it because it needs to be assessed and it needs to be seen whether it can be duplicated somewhere else, is the example of the special economic zone. In Jordan, the Jordanian government, together with the major donor like the World Bank and the EU and of course also UNHCR, have put in place a mechanism where money has been given in order to start businesses in a special zone, and those businesses will be using refugees as a labor. And they got the authorization in order to work. And the product, it was about textile and clothes. And the products were sold in the European Union without taxes. So it was a win-win situation for business corporations who had an opportunity to do business, for refugees in order to be working legally and to sustain themselves. For the host country, Jordan, it was part of its development policy, and the donors country have allowed the products to enter the EU without taxes. So there are models that have been developed during the last few years in view of the huge humanitarian crisis in the region, but there are still a lot of progress to be made because all the capability of the refugees have not been explored and used yet. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have to close there. Would either of you like to make any further comment on it?
No, that's no.
So I'd like to say thank you very much. Sorry, can I take one more question on not time? No, I'm afraid not. Sorry, you'll have to ask the panelist yourself. But thank you very much. And I think this has been a very interesting discussion about, with some concrete evidence of where the private sector really has actually been mobilized and works very closely with the UN and how the private sector takes action. Thank you.